The success of a video game doesn't always depend on great graphics and awesome visual effects. There are several other elements that are responsible for the success of a game. In this video, we take a look at a bunch of pretty games that flopped. Stay tuned and watch as some of the most graphically and visually pleasing games make the list. Marvel Avengers. It's surprising that this game is on the list, considering it has a player base and people who actually love the game. It was this flashy, awesome-looking game with realistic-looking Marvel characters, and yet another kind of endlessly replayable games that a lot of people just weren't looking for in a Marvel Avengers game. Now, if you've ever been on YouTube, you've probably heard most of the complaints about Marvel's Avengers from a gameplay and content offering standpoint, but you can't deny the game looks pretty good. The designs of the characters even though pre-release people weren't thinking they weren't so great, most of the characters, especially post-launch, do look really cool. The environments are pretty cool, but especially just the actual single-player campaign, the cutscenes, the character work, the looks of some of the costumes, the visual effects, the textures, the lighting, everything looks really damn good. It's unfortunate, though, that the actual game itself isn't quite what some people were really hoping for. Anthem. Before its release, Anthem really looked to be like a graphical powerhouse. Early demos of the game highlighted walking around the hub village area in first person with incredible character models and realistic animations and lighting in the crowded sci-fi marketplace, leading up to you hopping into your Javelin, your cool Iron Man mech suit that had an insane amount of detail on it and reflections and light, and then the final release ended up looking much flatter than that. The Javelin still looked really cool. The worlds themselves that you flew around were pretty vast, but even if you could still argue one way or another that the game was pretty looking, the actual gameplay itself wasn't so hot. You've probably heard enough about Anthem at this point, it being one of EA and BioWare's biggest flops. The game acts as a service game that nobody really ended up wanting just because nothing about it really felt quite right. Ryse Son of Rome. Ryse Son of Rome originally served as an Xbox One launch title, and a graphical showcase developed by Crytek, who ultimately said that they were not happy with the game's Xbox One sales after launch. From what we know, it seems like well after launch, it eventually went on to sell 1.3 million units, and ultimately, despite the game not being bad, it seemed like for a lot of people, it was a little bit of a forgettable experience. If you've seen one combat encounter, one mission in the game, you've seen it all, but this game actually does have a little bit of a cult following, because it does have some cool moments, but still, it didn't go on to become a franchise or anything like people were hoping, but it definitely delivered on the graphics front. Assassin's Creed Unity. Assassin's Creed Unity is a game that looked really good. The unfortunate thing that held it back wasn't that it was a commercial flop. It actually apparently sold pretty well, according to reports. What really held it back and made it fall from grace was the technical state it was initially released in. The console version of the game had terrible frame rates, the PC version wasn't really well optimized, and of course, you've seen all the glitches by now. Assassin's Creed Unity was glitchy as hell, with people's eyes popping out of their faces, just weird, horrific character contortions. You name it, you've probably seen it all at this point, but looking back at the game, now with it at least running okay, it's a decent Assassin's Creed game, and it is absolutely a gorgeous one. From the new parkour animations, with how the character can climb up and down buildings, which still blows my mind that they didn't continue that in further games, to just the level of detail of Paris, and down to the city street levels filled with characters, to the brimming of revolution, to the recreation of Notre Dame Cathedral, and how Ubisoft has actually used that as a historical reference, since the actual cathedral unfortunately did catch fire a few years ago. It says a lot about the graphical detail, the fidelity of the game. This thing was something else, and unfortunately, because of the early critical reception, the technical state it was in, it really didn't get its chance to really shine and live up to what it at least technically could have been. Knack. Next up we have Knack. Knack 1 and 2 became a meme thanks to Dunkey. But these harmless little platformer games were really designed to showcase the graphical power of the PlayStation 4, specifically with particle effects, and how the character of Knack was built out of a bunch of different voxels, all moving around in real time, more than we've ever seen in a character before, and with its fun, light, cartoony, crisp, bright atmosphere, it was definitely bold, but the gameplay itself still didn't help Knack really kind of attach and take off in the living room, whether in North America and in Japan. Knack 2 reportedly really bombed in Japan after it released, and didn't even crack the top 20 software releases when it did actually release, which is painful, especially like we're talking about games that missed the mark or flopped despite the initial boom. Blair Witch VR. This game is a spin-off of Bloober Team's first-person Blair Witch game. The game had some cool woods, horror moments, and some interesting little mechanics, but didn't really quite live up to the brand name that it's associated with, that hype. However, put that in VR and the game feels just better enough to really make it compelling and interesting. Is it an exact recreation of the original movie? No, and as long as you don't go in expecting that, you're in for a pretty good time. Unfortunately, Blair Witch VR didn't really seem to take off, at least in our radar, our sphere of the world. We haven't seen too many people talk about it. It actually has had its fair share of negative user reviews, but the more you look into it, it does seem like a lot of people are happy with the game. Agony. Up next we have Agony, an incredible looking game. This is a horror game with elements of sci-fi. The game had pretty realistic horror graphics, however its gameplay was pretty substandard. Basically the whole design of the game, the way it plays, does not take advantage of really showing off at any point just how good it can really look. The creature designs, the environments themselves, the gore, the nastiness of all of it doesn't reach the heights it could have, and that's a shame because I think of any game on this list, this one specifically, it's really just about the creative concepts, the real art design behind the whole thing, and how, unfortunately, the actual game really held it back. It was a bummer. Ancestors: The Humankind Odyssey. This game wasn't a financial flop in the sense considering they sold 1 million copies. However, while the game was visually pleasing, it didn't live up to expectations in terms of gameplay. Ancestors' whole premise was kind of like you starting as a primitive creature and slowly learning how to communicate, use tools, hunt to survive, and slowly kind of work your way up through to the Homo sapien. It had really dense jungle forests, incredibly detailed animals and wildlife, and really incredible animations, especially as you're running and climbing, and to see your character go from walking on 4 limbs to sort of walking upright was very cool, but it ultimately amounted to a very repetitive game that really didn't go anywhere and didn't have the payoff you were probably hoping. The Dark Pictures anthology Man of Medan. Now this is Supermassive Games' horror anthology series. Man of Medan was the first game. The game took place in the South Pacific Ocean, and was about 4 college friends on an adventure that, of course, slowly becomes a creepy horror story, and this was of course hot off the heels of their success of Until Dawn, so expectations were really high, and Man of Medan wasn't so great. We didn't enjoy it, we didn't think the payoff was too great, and playing it was kind of boring. That being said, we do not want to dunk on them as a whole. We still really like the developers, and the Dark Pictures anthology actually ended up getting much stronger. House of Ashes, the last game that has been published in this Dark Picture thing, is actually really good, so don't get it twisted, but the first game we weren't big fans of, but still, it looked incredible. Just the dark, creepy ship, everything wet, really did wonders and blew us away and kind of actually saved the game for us. We're glad that Supermassive Games stuck with the whole Dark Pictures thing and ended up making better games out of this. The Order 1886. This was a PlayStation 4 game. It was hyped up, it looked incredible, but unfortunately it was way too short and left people not really satisfied. Now this is a great game, and beating it in 4 hours feels like a disappointment. The visual style is awesome. This different take on 1880s London with a kind of sci-fi spin on it. You're a badass, you're Galahad, you're shooting dudes and creatures with cool laser guns, and it's tight, in a really cool gothic style setting. This game looked downright incredible for the time. It was a PlayStation 4 first-party game, and it had some banger visuals to it, and unfortunately it never really got updated. Alright guys, that's all for the video. Hope you enjoyed this one. Thanks for watching.